Shalom, shalom, friends. Welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, and I'm very happy to see you here today, whoever happens to be here. Do have confirmation that we're going live, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into it here today. So, as you know, here on the Watchdogs, we typically have a what would you call that? Pre-article, I guess, discussion right before we start reading the articles and things like that. And today, I'm not actually going to use that time to discuss news. Rather, I want to discuss basically some things about this channel and what your guys' opinions on them might be. For those of you who see this, of course, live or not, really doesn't matter. Either way, would certainly appreciate your opinions here. So basically, I obviously do these two programs. I do the Watchdog, which talks politics, talks news, talks things like, just anything that's related to sort of journalism or punditry, right? And I also do the Unapologetics, where we discuss things like Christian apologetics, faith study, and things of that nature. Now, the question I'm having basically with myself is whether or not I should split the channel into two, where each show is on a separate channel. So far, I'm differentiating the two with different, what would you call that? End screens. I don't really know what the word exactly is. The images that you upload. Thumbnails. That's what it is, right? With different thumbnails. That's the way I've been kind of differentiating the two so far. And of course, I don't typically do the Unapologetics live, whereas I do tend to do the Watchdogs live because it's news, right? So, that's kind of the reason for that. I also don't tend to show my face on the Watchdogs, things like that. There's a few things we do to differentiate them, but in the end, I'm wondering if it might just be too confusing, especially considering the fact that I also want to put a history program and a philosophy program up. So basically, the thing that I want to ask you guys is, what would you prefer? Do you think it's better to have all of my work on one channel? It's all kind of related anyway, history, philosophy, politics, religion, all that kind of stuff. Or do you think it would be best to kind of split them up into 4 separate channels? Let me know what you think either in the live chat or comment section below, depending on when you watch this. And with that, we're just going to go ahead and jump directly into articles. Except actually, there is one more thing I do want to mention. You might see the banner there below. Support me on Patreon if you would like to do so. If you feel that this kind of stuff is worth it, and if this is a message that needs to get out to people, please do click the link in the description to support on Patreon. I'm going to have links to all the articles as well that we use here today, and any other social media you guys want to follow me on there. But nonetheless, we have a lot to talk about, so I don't want to start babbling on about all of this stuff too much. You're right. We can go ahead and just jump right into stuff. Basically, there's a lot to talk about, right? There's an absolute load to talk about. So first off, let's get into some domestic news. The headliner for today that we had, Coney Barrett has been confirmed. Coney Barrett is, of course, the judge that Trump has recently announced for, the Supreme Court. We recently saw the passing of Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was appointed by President Bill Clinton. She passed away at about the age of 87 years old. And of course, this has been something that has been oft spoken about because Republicans famously said that there was no reason to appoint a judge during an election year in 2016. We are now, of course, much closer to the election, and yet they decided it was a good idea to appoint a new judge. Now, I do understand both sides of the coin here, because on one end, it is, of course, incredibly, dishonest in a way that it's totally not cool when you do it, but absolutely fine when we do it, right? That's, of course, a dishonest example of politics. Now, I obviously think there's some level of difference only in the fact that I think the ideology of leftism is toxic, and the ideology that is supposed to be conservatism, i.e. constitutionalism, is actually a very good thing. But I do think there is something to be said about civics and about principle. With that being said, what's done is done, and there's no reason for us to sit up here and complain about how everything was handled, right? And it's entirely possible that maybe this is what is necessary, considering the levels of debauchery that are currently occupying the minds of most of the electorate, right? So we need to talk about Amy Coney Barrett herself. We need to talk about the confirmation process. We need to focus on what is here in the now. By the way, like this video, share this video, get this out to anybody you want. We're going right into the articles now. So if anybody's going to start watching, they should do so at this moment. Of course, not that anybody has a whole lot of control over that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We'll share probably not full screen, so y'all can see my lovely mug. And by lovely mug, of course, I actually just mean an icon, because you can't actually see my lovely mug here. At any rate, just a moment. Get these articles pulled up. Alrighty. So here we have from The Guardian, Amy Coney Barrett confirmed to Supreme Court in major victory for U.S. conservatives. Now, I would like to offer somewhat of a different perspective here. I am not saying that Amy Coney Barrett is the equivalent of what would have been appointed by Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or etc. So I want people to hear exactly what I am saying. However, what I am going to tell you here today is that Amy Coney Barrett is in no way, shape, or form what conservatives should want as their Supreme Court justice pick. There's a lot of reasons why. We're going to get into those reasons, but I just want to be clear. This is a victory in name only in numerous ways, right? And because of the incompetence of both the left and right wing, we never actually got a chance to talk about what Amy Coney Barrett actually supports, right? Rather, we had to talk about whether or not it was a good thing for her to be against abortion, or whether or not her faith was a good thing, or whether or not she could be impartial because she had 7 kids, and a whole bunch of nonsense like that that was completely and totally irrelevant to her position as the judge. Now, that, of course, is the fault of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is absolutely useless, and they always will be, so I'm not necessarily shocked by that. But that means there was a lot that went unsaid. By the way, I just noticed I actually have this misspelled. It's Comey Barrett in the banner that I have. It's actually Coney Barrett with an N. So I apologize for that, friends. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and get right into the article here today. I actually have that misspelled twice. Wow, I did that in the title of this too. My apologies. Anyways, I'll get that fixed. So going right into the article, the U.S. Senate has confirmed Amy Coney Barrett to the United States Supreme Court, delivering Donald Trump a huge but partisan victory just 8 days before the election and locking in right-wing domination of the nation's highest court for years to come. Though the vote was a formality, with senators divided almost entirely along party lines, it still marked a seismic movement for Trump, for the Supreme Court, and for American democracy. Now, to be fair, it does need to be noted really quick. The Guardian is a left-wing news source with a heavy left-wing bias. I'm fairly certain they're also a British news source, so they're not actually coming at this from an American perspective. But nonetheless, I just wanted to let everybody know that, right, so that you were aware of some of the predispositions and biases here. Though the vote was a formality, I already read that, sorry. For the president, it means his legacy on judicial appointees is secure whatever the outcome of next week's election. Trump will have placed 3 conservative justices on the court, albeit in highly contentious circumstances. Now, for those of you who have watched a lot of Watchdogs in the past, which I understand isn't very many people, but you will note that that is actually not the case. The left would like you to believe that's the case because they want you to believe we're in crisis. And the right would like you to believe that's the case because they want you to believe that everything is going fantastically and there's a great kumbaya whenever the right wing is actually in power. But in reality, there is actually some incredibly disappointing aspects of all 3 judges that have been nominated by President Donald Trump. And more often than not, because of the absolute incompetence, and indeed evil of the Democratic Party, we never actually got to discuss some of these issues, which are indeed very important to the survival of our democracy. I'll give you a perfect example just very quickly. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, right, has famously said that he does not actually believe that citizens should have the right to, that government should have the right to prosecute people while they are currently sitting in office, right? So in other words, if you have somebody who is enacting or who is involved with, rather, right, some level of corruption, and we find them guilty of that corruption, Kavanaugh says, well, if they're still in power, you can't actually charge them with that corruption, which obviously you can see why that's a problem. They'll just keep the power indefinitely, and then they'll never get charged with corruption. There's actually a lot of real world examples of this outside of our country. For example, President Vladimir Putin in Russia and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Netanyahu, who I actually was a huge fan of for quite some time, is more than likely going to be in court for fraud. He has indeed been indicted for fraud, and for a long period of time, he cannot actually go to court because he was the prime minister. He still is the prime minister, and as a result, he won't actually be able to go to court until after his current 1.5-year term ends, but nonetheless, you see some real-world consequences of this. A man who was being accused of bribery in 2015, in 2020, is still uncharged, right? So with that, you can kind of see how, problematic it is for Kavanaugh to say, hey, I actually don't think that we should have the ability even to go after somebody who is actually a current sitting official. And to give you another just hypothetical example as to how that could be very, very poorly used by corrupt officials. Let's imagine, if you will, somebody who is actually committing some level of tax fraud, right? And let's say they decided to run for a local office as representative, right? Just as they were actually being charged with tax fraud, but they hadn't actually been brought to court yet. Well, there's no law in their particular region about being elected if you're, not a felon or anything like that, and they're not currently a felon, right? And so they go ahead and get elected. Now, all of a sudden, just because of a matter of timing, you can't bring this indictment on this person who was obviously committing tax fraud. And they literally get to use their position as a politician as an excuse to push off the election, or excuse me, not the election, the investigation, or the indictment. Right? I got that wrong twice. Push off the indictment, right? For the crime of tax fraud in this particular example, right? So you can, of course, see how this could be very misused by corrupt officials. Just one moment, I'll take a drink here of my coffee. So with that, right, you just want to point out, that's only obviously one example, but you just want to point out that this is not actually something that has been, immensely, what would I say, positive, I guess, for the ideology that is conservatism, right? If anything, these have been victories in name only that people with very obvious political agendas have tried to make you believe are victories for a certain side because it either helps or hurts their narrative, or helps their narrative or hurts the opposing narrative, rather, right? For the Supreme Court, it sealed an unassailable 6-3 balance between conservatives and liberal justices, sort of. Gorsuch has already been very wishy-washy on a lot of issues. For example, he voted in favor of the LGBT activists earlier this year, in a court case that basically was trying to decide whether or not you could actually, quote unquote, discriminate against somebody for reasons of transgenderism, right? So basically the idea was, according to Gorsuch, that if somebody wears a dress, for example, and you fire them for that, while a woman could come in and wear a dress and you would not have fired them for that. In other words, you are punishing this person for something only because of their gender, because if they were a different gender and did the self-same thing, you would not be punishing them. And therefore, he reasoned that it is not lawful under the United States Constitution to actually fire somebody for, or not hire somebody or something along those lines, right? To not hire or fire, et cetera, somebody based on the, I guess, sexual gender orientation, rather, that they would have, gender identity that they would have, right? That is Gorsuch at the moment. So, and obviously I already told you this thing about Kavanaugh. We're going to get to a few things about Barrett, but the point being that this is not a super conservative court by any stretch of the imagination. The oldest of those conservatives, Clarence Thomas, is 72 and still has potentially many years to serve within his lifetime appointment. Mitch MCConnell, the Republican leader, majority leader, underlined the political importance of the moment when he said on Sunday, quote, A lot of what we've done over the last 4 years will be undone sooner or later by the next election. They won't be able to do much about this for a long time to come, end quote. And of course, they beg to differ, right? They want to go ahead and do things like stacking the court, or packing the court, rather. And that's obviously very problematic in a lot of different ways. But nonetheless, we don't have time to get into all that, so we'll continue. For U.S. democracy, the confirmation gives the conservative justices the upper hand on such hot-button issues as abortion, same-sex marriage, and the climate crisis, areas where public opinion is firmly in favor of progressive change. Now, how much do you want to bet? Because I literally can almost guarantee it. How much do you want to bet that this court does not, let me repeat, does not overturn this recent ruling we had on quote-unquote transgender discrimination, does not overturn Roe v. Wade? It definitely isn't going to overturn Oberfeld, right? And Hodges, right? That's just not happening. So on and so forth. I guarantee you, right? It's just simply not going to happen. The climate change issue, maybe. That's an interesting one. But I would quickly point out that at least 5 and potentially as high as 7 of the current justices are Roman Catholics. And if Pope Francis does indeed decide to, from his papal chair, declare that the climate issue is an issue of faith for Catholics, then they actually won't really have much of a choice if they actually, have the courage of their religious convictions. That's neither here nor there, but I would just point that out, right? It's not necessarily a win on the climate issue either, given some pretty reasonable situations that could definitely and probably will end up happening in the future. The confirmation will leave a residue of bitter partisan rancor given the Republican push to push Barrett through days before the election, the closest confirmation to a presidential election in U.S. history, having refused 4 years ago to countenance Barack Obama's pick for the Supreme Court on grounds that the people should decide. I have a feeling that's probably not true, that this is the closest to election day, but it definitely could be, considering it's only 8 days away. And I don't know that for a fact, but I just have a sneaking suspicion. Nonetheless, Trump moved quickly to nominate Barrett, who was 48, to succeed the liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died on September the 18th at the age of 87. Barrett, a favorite of Christian conservatives, signed a 2006 newspaper ad that called for the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the 1973 ruling that legalized abortion, and called its legacy barbaric. She did not disclose the ad to the Senate. And to be fair, that is actually the most conservative, as far as the pro-life issue is concerned, position any of the 3 judges have put forward. Once again, though, I think it's just sweet nothings in your ear, like it always is. At least in one instance, Gorsuch, he outright said that this was precedent, Roe v. Wade, and as such needed to be respected. So he's not going to vote in favor of repealing it. We have a guarantee. Kavanaugh seemed very wishy-washy on the deal. We'll see what happens. And I just don't trust Barrett to actually be definitive about it, because virtually nobody ever is, right? In fact, you see that I was just debating John Maddox yesterday about President Trump and whether or not he's good for conservatism. Very good discussion, by the way, if you guys want to check it out over on Logical, Plausible, Probable. Nonetheless, we got into the discussion about whether or not Trump's going far enough. And I pointed out, right, it's one thing to, I reinstated the Mexico City policy. That's fine. Okay, but you had a Senate and a House of Representatives and a Supreme Court and, of course, the presidency that were all supposedly conservative, and you couldn't get Planned Parenthood defunded. I mean, I feel like that's a small ask, right? But in the end, they're not even really interested with it. There wasn't even a push to get Planned Parenthood defunded, right? And the point there being that I don't trust these so-called conservatives to actually be on the side of righteousness, what I would call righteousness, in this pro-life issue. I really genuinely don't. I think it's, whispering sweet nothings in your ear. I think it's political platitudes. By the way, Brother Nicholas, I appreciate you putting the debate there in the live chat. I also want to say shalom to you. I just noticed you were there. Nonetheless, I don't trust them, right? I don't trust them. I have no reason to trust them. But nonetheless, we continue. Barrett, a favorite of Christian conservatives, blah, blah, blah. Already read that. Trump has also said he expects the court to decide the outcome of a disputed election as it did in 2000, and wants Barrett on the bench for any election-related cases. which of course is going to be relatively important because that's something that could absolutely end up occurring. So what are some of the issues that I have with Amy Coney Barrett, right? We see that she's been appointed. I've pointed out that from a civics perspective, it is a little bit hypocritical, I guess, to say the least, would be the best way I'd want to put it, right? But what else does ACB, as she has been called, confirmation? Well, what other problems do I have with this confirmation, right? Well, so first off, one of the biggest things is, and one of the most important things, considering everything that's in the news today, is ACB has stated and has been on the record as far as being on the bench, right, that she is in favor of forced vaccination. Now, I want to be clear for everybody, right? I am not an anti-vaxxer. I do not believe vaccination leads to autism. I do not believe that there is, some mercury that is poisoning, 400,000 kids every year or something like that, or some ridiculous conspiracy theory, because there's a lot of weird and definitely wrong conspiracy theories surrounding vaccines. However, there's also a lot of healthy criticism and skepticism about vaccines, and especially about forced vaccination. Let me be perfectly clear about something. You do not have the right to insert a foreign antibody, or any foreign thing for that matter, into another person without their consent. I feel like that should be obvious. I mean, it's just as obvious as saying you shouldn't insert your you-know-what into a woman's you-know-what without her consent. It's the exact same concept, right? And quite frankly, when you start saying things like, oh, we are okay with forced vaccination because of the health of the populace, well, at what point does that logic cease? For example, what if we start creating some sort of a biological cyborgs, as they say they are now creating in some laboratories across the world, and they want to inject those sorts of things into your antibodies, and they maybe make your immune system stronger and weed out certain genetic diseases and so on and so forth, and they say you absolutely must get it for the safety of society. What if it's a microchip? And they say, hey, well, this is going to be a way that we reduce crime because there's no cash. We can make sure we know exactly where every single purchase is. And so for the safety of all society, you need to be microchipped, so on and so forth, right? How far are you willing to go down the road of, well, for the safety of all mankind, screw your rights, and we're going to do such and such a thing, right? And that is where I stand on the issue of forced vaccination. Now, Amy Coney Barrett has actually in the past voted against the anti-vax movement, saying that people do not actually have the right to pull out of these things like forced vaccination. And by forced vaccination, I mean in particular in public schooling, right? So get this, right? They're going to put you in jail for truancy if you don't actually go to public school. But then if you don't go to that public school, if you go to that public school, rather, they're going to force you to violate something that you maybe have a philosophical or religious conviction against, right? Let me go ahead and really quick, I want to pull up the actual court case. So just one moment. I apologize, friends. I should have had this up already. I always get at least some of my articles up, but not all of them. Well, so, I can't waste too much time, I guess, pulling that up. So I'm going to continue to pull it up, and we're going to return to this in a moment. So I apologize for that, friends. Nonetheless, so Amy Coney Barrett is appointed the head now here. Man, hang on. I need to actually get this up. I apologize. I'm going to have to find some kind of like music or something to hold this over, because I can't just leave the news like that. That was a huge biff on my part. So, man, my apologies. That's a biff. Well, we'll get that. We'll get it nonetheless. I have to just go through my Twitter. I'll make sure to do it at least by the next episode, but nonetheless, I can't waste all of the time here just looking for this article. I thought I had all of them up. Guess I didn't. That's my fault. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and move forward. And you know what? With that, I think that that's probably a good place to just move forward completely, because if I don't have, I'm noticing here, I don't have the whole list. It's on my Twitter here. If I don't have the whole list of cases, then we can't go any further other than letting you guys know that this is confirmed, because that would be basically malpractice on my part. So we're going to move forward. We'll actually talk more about this again, probably on Wednesday, because that's probably when I'll do my new next Watchdog. And I'm going to go ahead and apologize for that. So Amy Coney Barrett confirmed. Let's move forward. I got a new banner that I got to throw up for you guys, because here's our second story. The United Nations has decided, I don't know by what authority they have decided this. Apparently, the United Nations seems to think that they actually have some level of legitimate authority. But nonetheless, I digress there. The United Nations has decided that they're going to work towards a treaty banning nuclear weapons and have it enter into force January of 2021. You see here, UN treaty banning nuclear weapons set to enter into force in January. This is from UN News, which is, as you might be able to deduce yourself, a news agency that is directly associated with the United Nations. This is published on the 25th of October, 2020. We are currently in the 26th of October, 2020. So just to let you guys know about how current this news actually is. Let's go right in. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in a statement, commended all the countries whose ratification of the accord, approved by 122 nations at the General Assembly in 2017. You know what? I missed a paragraph. My apologies. In what leading campaigners are describing as a new chapter of nuclear disarmament, the ratification of the Treaty of the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons will now come into force on January 22nd. 2021, of course, after Honduras became the 50th member state to ratify on Saturday. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is, in a statement, commended all the countries whose ratification of the accord, approved by 122 nations at the General Assembly in 2017, who have helped bring the ban on weapons this far, singling out the work of civil society groups. Chief among those, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, declared through Executive Director Beatrice Finn that the coming into force was a new chapter for nuclear disarmament. Decades of activism have achieved what many said, there's a typo there, they're missing the D. What many said was impossible. Nuclear weapons are banned. Now, of course, once again, I need to point out, banned by what authority exactly? I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. I don't know if you guys can actually see this. Banned by what authority? They're not really going to let us know, right? The United Nations, at least currently, does not actually have any authority. In the future, they might. They certainly would like to have some authority. The United Nations would absolutely adore having the ability to bully nations and tell them what to do. Now, many of you might be a little bit confused. Isn't denuclearization a good thing? And, of course, denuclearization would be a good thing if it were actually feasible. The thing is it's not. And for the self-same reason why I think gun control is ridiculous and evil, I also think denuclearization is ridiculous and evil. The only thing you do when you set up these quote-unquote agreements is guarantee that the good guys will get rid of their weapons. But the bad guys don't follow these agreements, right? And by the way, the bad guys sometimes happen to be the United States of America. Let's not forget that we invaded the nation of Iraq based on reports of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, right? So let's just point that out. For the same reason that we need to make sure that the good guys have guns and are able to do so without impediment, We need to make sure that certain nations are allowed to actually have their nuclear weapons, because other nations, if they are the only nations that have nuclear weapons, will absolutely bully smaller nations who may or may not actually have these evil agendas, right? It's the concept of mutually assured destruction, and it is the closest we can possibly get to utopia. I'm sorry, humans suck, and that's just the way that it is, right? But more importantly than that is the authority question, right? Let's say it actually was possible. Let's say we could trust all nations to actually toss all their nukes and never again start building more. At that point, you now have to trust a international body, a global government, quite literally, right, to enforce this, to remove sovereignty from individual nations, and enforce this, obviously, at the point of a gun, because that's how you enforce any law, right, across all nations in the globe. And, of course, that could expand to much different things. For example, the majority of the world at this point in time would think that we should allow abortion. The majority of the world at this point in time thinks that gun control is a good thing. Open borders is quite the hot topic in the West these days, specifically in Europe, etc., etc. You do not want, even if it is for a good reason, you do not want global government removing the sovereignty of individual nations who are supposed to be sovereign in unto themselves. Excuse me. Right? You don't want the United Nations telling the United States whether or not they can or cannot have individual private citizenry with weapons or forming militias or things like that. And the same exact authority that wants to do that and that would be needed in order to achieve that is what wants to denuclearize the planet and would be needed in order to achieve denuclearization of the planet. So always remember these sorts of things. When it sounds good, that doesn't mean that it is good, right? Decades of activism have achieved nuclear weapons are banned, etc. Moving on, my apologies. One survivor of the atomic bombing at Hiroshima, Setsuko Thurlow, told ICANN that she had committed her whole life to abolition. Quote, "I have nothing but gratitude for all those who have worked for the success of our treaty," end quote, she said. Saturday's milestone was reached a day after the island nations of Jamaica and Nauru submitted their ratifications, meaning that in 90 days the treaty will become active, banning nuclear weapons in just over 75 banning nuclear weapons just over 75 years after they were first used at the end of World War II. There's another typo here, so I just had to briefly correct the writer there, so I apologize, friends. Real quickly, before we move on here on these paragraphs, I do want to point out some of these quotes. So today on UN Day, TPNW, which is, I believe, what is that? I guess I'm not 100% sure what that is. Gets 50 ratifications. That's the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Okay. Gets 50 ratifications required for entry into force with Honduras. This person, who is Izumi Nakamitsu, tweets, "I echo the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, and congratulate the states that have ratified the TPNW and civil society, which has been instrumental in facilitating its negotiations and ratification." Here we have that actual quote from Gutierrez, who, by the way, is a Jesuit, I'd just like to point out, or I believe is a Jesuit. I know for a fact he's a Roman Catholic. I'm not 100% sure if he's a Jesuit, actually, but I have heard that nonetheless. Quote, "The Secretary General commends the states that have ratified the treaty and salutes the work of civil society, which has been instrumental in facilitating the negotiation and ratification of the treaty," end quote. So, tribute to survivors. Quote, "Entry into force is a tribute to the survivors of nuclear explosions and tests, many of whom advocated for this treaty," end quote, said the UN chief in his statement. Mr. Gutierrez described the entry into force as, quote, "the culmination of a worldwide movement to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any nuclear weapons. Any use of nuclear weapons, rather. It represents a meaningful commitment towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which remains the highest disarmament priority of the United Nations," end quote. Mr. Gutierrez said he was looking forward to doing his part in facilitating the treaty's progress towards total elimination. So far, the main nuclear powers of the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France have not signed the accord, which to a certain extent is kind of a good thing because it means that the accord is basically meaningless at this point. It's just something that a bunch of activists would like to do. Even though it was ratified by the United Nations doesn't actually have any power, as I was saying earlier, though they would like to have that power. The treaty declares that the countries ratifying it must, quote, never under any circumstances develop, test, produce, manufacture, or otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, end quote. Adopted on the 7th of July, 2017 at a UN conference in New York, the treaty represented the first multilateral legally binding instrument for nuclear disarmament in 2 decades. See, this word they use, legally binding, right? It doesn't really mean what they think it means, right? What do I mean by that? Well, there's not, like I said, anything that you can actually do to stop a nation from producing nuclear weapons, even a nation that has ratified this agreement. We see that in the Paris Climate Accord, right? Another completely bogus idea that if there was ever any power behind it would absolutely lead to more death than it would save, than lives it would save, rather, right? China, who ratified that agreement, had no intention of following it, has no intention of following it, and indeed has increased carbon emissions since it was signed. The United States, who also affirmed and signed on to that agreement, left without any consequences whatsoever, which, to be fair, I think is a good thing, but the point is, there's no authority there, right? Now, obviously, I don't want any authority, but the point is, right, these groups, they pretend like they have authority, and they want that authority, and we need to watch them to make sure they don't get that authority. But it does need to be stated in the here and now that while they're pretending to have that authority, they indeed do not. International law is not real, right? It's the imagination of activists is basically what it is. It has no binding on actual nations because nations, quite frankly, don't follow it. You don't have a enforcement agency. There's no police. There's no military for the United Nations to actually bully other nations into accepting these terms and conditions. It's a good thing, but, again, it does need to be noted. This is just a bunch of people in a room patting each other on the back, and absolutely nothing will come of it, provided that everything is going the way that it goes now. It's obviously still worthy of us reporting on because things may not continue on the current status quo. In fact, I very much believe the United Nations will at some point in the very near future have the power to enforce its decrees. But at the moment, it does not. Adopted on I already read that. Vindication for a new generation. Speaking to journalists at UN headquarters in early October, after being announced winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, ICANN chief Miss Finn said that a new generation of campaigners had come of age, and, quote, people who grew up after the Cold War and didn't understand why we still have the nuclear weapons, end quote. In its statement released on Sunday, ICANN, an umbrella organization and campaign for dozens of groups across the world, said that the coming into force was just the beginning. Once the treaty is in force, all states parties will need to implement all of their positive obligations under the treaty and abide by its prohibitions. Quote, states that haven't joined the treaty will feel its power too. We can expect companies to stop producing nuclear weapons and financial institutions to stop investing in nuclear weapons producing companies, end quote. And thus ends the article there. So, there you have it. The United Nations has a treaty about getting rid of nuclear weapons. We will, in a later episode, actually read the treaty verbatim, as we do on this show, because that's just what we do on this show. You need to know the documents that are actually potentially going to have something to do with your life in the near future. But we don't have the time at the moment, so just want you guys to note that, and we'll have, of course, links to all of the articles we use in the description. Just one moment. I want to get a drink of my coffee here. I really like that I found these banners because it makes this feel a little bit more like a news show, right? I'm just looking here at my phone. By the way, Shalom America, I see you here in the live chat. I'm looking here at my phone and it says that, right, United Nations bans nukes, question mark. And then below there, the thing with my Patreon. And that's just, it makes this feel more like a news show. I'm not going to do all this kind of stuff when I do apologetics because that's talking about faith and apologetics, right? But nonetheless, which, by the way, those of you who have been missing that, just so you know, tune in this Saturday for an Unapologetics Light and Sunday for a full episode of Unapologetics. It's been a while, but I am going to finally finish my response to Pile Ben Avraham of Kararai Jews for Judaism. Nonetheless, let's move on. So, new banner for you as we move on to a new topic. Trump claiming the Saudis could make a deal with Israel. You heard that correctly. We don't know how true it is, but Trump has claimed that he expects Saudi Arabia to actually sign on to these Abraham Accords, as they're all colloquially being called, even though one of these statements is only officially called the Abraham Accords. He expects Saudi Arabia to sign on to these colloquial Abraham Accords, as well as 4 other nations. Now, this is from the Epoch Times. Now, to be fair, I know that there are some people who disapprove of the Epoch Times. What is this? I didn't have this just a second ago. What's going on here? Not cool. Come on. You turn away for 5 seconds, and these guys... that's annoying. Well, there's another article we can pull up from this. So just a moment. Literally just reading this article. All right, here we go. The Hill. They're not going to make me get a subscription. That's ridiculous. Anyways, I was just about to defend the Epoch Times, and now I have to stop my defense and stop my show and ruin my entire flow because they decided to be stupid and make me get a subscription to read their articles that they're not even going to make me pay for. That makes no sense, but whatever. I probably shouldn't call them stupid. That's not very nice. Anyways, Trump says Saudi Arabia will soon recognize Israel. This is from The Hill. Laura Kelly writing 3 days ago, meaning October the 23rd. President Trump said Friday that he expects Saudi Arabia to open diplomatic ties with Israel soon, following the announcement that Sudan had agreed to normalize relations with the Jewish state. One more time, just in case you think you're living in the Twilight world. Pinch yourself, you're not dreaming. Twilight Zone, excuse me. President Trump said said Friday that he expects Saudi Arabia to open diplomatic ties with Israel soon, following the announcement that Sudan had agreed to normalize relations with the Jewish state. Yes, Saudi Arabia, birthplace of Islam, homeland of the Arab people formerly known as the Ishmaelites, the very heart of Wahhabism and Salafi terrorism. They, the theocratic monarchy whose constitution is literally the Quran, might actually recognize Israel and have diplomatic relations with them. If you're shocked, you shouldn't be at this point, because literally nothing is impossible in 2020. And frankly, as we've been reporting on these watchdogs for years now, this kind of thing is very expected. There is a solid push for global governance, and Trump is involved, my friends. Trump is involved. He is against globalism in some ways, but he is not actually truly against globalism in the ways that you want to be against globalism. I guarantee it. Quote, so we have many countries, as you know, getting ready, and we also have, I'm sure you'll see Saudi Arabia there very soon, end quote, the president said in remarks to the press from the Oval Office. Quote, I really believe that will happen too, and very good relations with Saudi Arabia, and so you'll see something very special, end quote. And of course, Trump does have very solid relations with the Saudis. The Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is actually the de facto king for all intents and purposes, he has shown a little bit of warmness to the idea that he could potentially be recognizing Israel and having full diplomatic relations with them. Now, whether or not he actually would is obviously a point for some dispute. I certainly think he would, because the thing about Mohammed bin Salman, though he's an evil, evil man, he is absolutely a dirtbag, and he is peak corrupt. Despite those things, he, very similarly to Pope Francis, actually, is willing to kind of shirk the status quo in favor of something that will give him what he perceives to be a win in the power department. A perfect example of that is when he decided that he was going to build a offshore resort on an island just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, in between Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Red Sea, right? He said he would build a resort there where people could wear short shorts and bikinis, you could drink alcohol, you could go watch movies, and listen to rock and roll, right? The Emoji Movie actually was the first movie ever shown in Saudi Arabia, fun fact, back in 2014. Even though King Salman is the actual king of Saudi Arabia, Salman is geriatric and senile, so he has, he's a figurehead, for lack of a better term. And it was Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who was pushing all of these things forward. Mohammed bin Salman also was willing to purge some of the groups that had a little bit of financial relation to certain terrorist groups, right, in order to make Saudi Arabia look better in the eyes of the rest of the world. Now, those things obviously probably sound like some good things in some ways, although, to be fair, I don't really think that legalization of short shorts is a great thing. I mean, obviously, women shouldn't be stoned for wearing short shorts. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it should be illegal. I am, however, saying that, like, the idea of liberated society is kind of weird when that's what you're talking about, and not, for example, freedom of the press and freedom of religion and things like that. But I digress. For those of you who might think, well, these are examples of a progressive mindset with Mohammed bin Salman, well, bear in mind that this is also the person who purged anybody who could potentially challenge his rule or his claim to the throne. This is also the person who has, in a very, very shady manner, had virtually constant underground, secret, behind closed doors, don't get the manuscript kind of conversations when he works foreign policy. This is also the man who had the Khashoggi, or however you say his last name, the journalist, right, murdered in Turkey. So there's still a lot of improvement, if you will, there, right? And in all the places where he is, quote unquote, an improvement, in reality, he's just trying to pacify his populace and make things look better. That's very obvious, right? When you start legalizing women's ability to run around naked, but not legalizing the ability to argue for women to run around naked, or to not, or to be a Christian, or to, right, so on and so forth, right? You don't actually want your big rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, things like that, freedom of the press. But yeah, sure, you can watch the Emoji Movie and wear a bikini, right? That's a perfect example of somebody who's trying to pacify you. They're not actually interested in liberty, right? But nonetheless, Trump said that about 5 more countries are expected to announce open relations with Israel as part of the administration's efforts to establish diplomatic ties between the Jewish state and Arab and Muslim majority states, and as a counter to Iran. Now, of course, he's obviously ousting Saudi Arabia as one of those 5. Sudan, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates have already, have already signed deals. We read, actually, the Abraham Accords as well as the peace deal with Bahrain and the UAE. We're not going to read the peace deal with Sudan today, although we will be reading it this week. But nonetheless, he's expecting at least one of these other 5 nations to be Saudi Arabia. And if he is right that 5 nations actually will sign diplomatic relation deals, right, peace deals, whatever you want to call them, with Israel, that would actually move us up to a total of 8 nations, Muslim majority, Arab majority nations, normalizing relations with Israel and signing peace deals with them. Which, of course, will do very interesting things, not only to the conflict of Iran versus the rest of the Middle East, but also to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the issue of the Temple Mount, which is very important considering the fact that Yehuda Glick wants to run for president of Israel, by the way. But I digress. You can go watch another episode of the Watchdog from last week to get more news on that. It'll also have huge impact, though, and this is something people aren't talking about very much, on the Turkey versus Europe issue, right? Let's remember, Turkey is currently having very big problems with Greece and indeed the entire European Union. It wants to be a member of the European Union, and some states agree. Other states, for example, Greece, think that it is essentially a Trojan horse to allow Islamism back into the West. The Turkish President Erdogan has made absolutely no effort whatsoever to quell Greek fears. In fact, he's nearly started wars with Greece multiple times. And an ally of Turkey, Azerbaijan, has been going back and forth constantly with an ally of Greece in Europe, i.e. Armenia, as we speak, right? So all of those things will easily be greatly affected by any sort of peace deals signed with any Arab nations, but especially a nation as important historically and economically and politically and etc. as the nation that is Saudi Arabia, right? Now, I don't know what those other nations will be. I have a sneaking suspicion, if I could guess, Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria, probably Lebanon, and I might imagine, maybe another one of the Gulf countries like Oman, maybe, or something like that, right? I say that because those are the countries which are close and which America has a serious level of influence over, especially Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Nonetheless, the flurry of diplomacy comes less than 2 weeks before the election, and as Trump seeks to promote himself as a peace and deal maker over his opponent, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden, which I suppose he has somewhat of an argument, doesn't he? I'm not necessarily endorsing these peace deals, although I'm not necessarily condemning them either. But Trump definitely has delivered. I think we can all agree to that. Trump absolutely, positively, beyond any shadow of a doubt, has delivered when he said that he was going to try and make peace in the Middle East. He's done more so than any other president in American history. That much is absolutely factual, right? And I don't think there's any way we could deny that unless we were just being partisan hacks, quite frankly. Quote, do you think Sleepy Joe could have made this deal, BB? End quote, Trump said in a phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office. Quote, Sleepy Joe, do you think he would have made this deal somehow? I don't think so, end quote. Quote, we appreciate the help for peace from anyone in America, and we appreciate what you've done, end quote. Netanyahu responded, a much, much better politician, right, than Donald Trump is. But I digress. I mean, Netanyahu is currently, being locked in a whole bunch of corruption charges. So I guess, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in the end, that you're a good politician. Sudan on Friday became the third country the Trump administration has helped broker relations with Israel, following the signing last month at the White House of the Abraham Accords, formalizing diplomatic ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, as well as Jordan in 1994. Trump said that an additional signing ceremony will take place to formalize the relations with Sudan and the expected, additional countries. Quote, ultimately, we're going to have a big reunion at the end where everybody's here and everybody's going to be signed, and we expect that Saudi Arabia will be one of those countries, end quote, Trump has said. Saudi Arabia has largely signaled softer relations to Israel and are reported to have convert security and diplomatic ties for years as a counter to Iran's influence in the region. We've reported on that here. Let's see. Riyadh's most recent public recognition of Israel was allowing its use of airspace by commercial Israeli flights following the brokering of relations between Israel and the UAE. So we see here that we actually have potentially very serious moves towards what we would consider to be peace in the Middle East. I personally think that these are going to end up being very dangerous for numerous reasons. Number one, I think that we are going to see something very big taking place in Israel over the next couple of years. Everything is coming into play for some absolutely world-bending events, mind-destroying events, reality-warping events to take place in the state of Israel. If we get peace between Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, the holiest nation in Islam, the birthplace of the Muslim people, the Ishmaelites, right? If we get a peace deal between them and Israel, if they're indeed on the exact same side, if Jordan, the custodian of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, right, is on this side as well, and the UAE and Bahrain and a whole bunch of smaller countries as well, right? If we actually get this level of peace, at least in writing, between the Arab countries and the Jewish nation, how likely do you think it is, especially considering the fact that we have a Temple Mount movement figurehead in Yehuda Glick, right, running for president in Israel come 2021, how likely do you think it is that we actually see an establishment of the internationalization of the old city, which has been pushed since 1947 by the United Nations, pushed by the Vatican ever since as well, though with slight alteration, and is now, of course, pushed by Trump? How likely do you think that is? How likely do you think it is that we actually get some level of quote-unquote two-state solution, Palestine and Israel? How likely do you think it is that we maybe see a rebuilt third temple, potentially even side by side with the Dome of the Rock? How likely do you think it is, and this is the big one, this is the kicker, how likely do you think it is if we have an internationalized city, peace in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Jews, as well as, right, and this is the important part, as well as a built third temple with a president of Israel whose stated goal would be to build that temple? How likely do you think it is that we actually get Shimon Peres and Pope Francis's idea, which they pushed in 2014, right before they had the World Alliance of Religions for Peace conference? How likely do you think it is that we get that established United Nations of Religions? My friends, I would say it's guaranteed. And remember, the United Nations of Religions and World Alliance of Religions for Peace and things of that nature is not conspiracy theory, right? This is stuff that the Vatican, that the president of Israel, Shimon Peres, former president now passed, has been very, very forward about. Rabbi Yehuda Glick, who is running for president in 2021, has been very forward about wanting to reestablish a third temple in the Levitical priesthood, right? These are not underground people from www.reptilianpeoplearunninusfromthemoon.com. These are the sources themselves. Glick himself, Peres himself. We just showed you a United Nations article, for crying out loud, right? This is what's going down, my friends. Nonetheless, I think we're going to move on. Because there's some other stuff we need to talk about. I'm fairly certain that I've hit about, 52 minutes. I try to make these only an hour, so there's no way I'm going to get to everything else that I want to. But nonetheless, last thing we want to talk about today, the Grand Blasphemous himself, Pope Francis, has indeed named 13 new cardinals to the Council of Cardinals. 9 of these cardinals will be under the age of 80, which means eligible to vote for the next pope. And in other elections like it, right? 73 of the 128 eligible cardinals for voting have now been appointed by Pope Francis. That is 57% of the College of Cardinals. And in a very real way, Francis has absolutely packed the College of Cardinals to his liking. So I'm going to briefly go through those who he appointed. This has actually been a relatively talked about topic in the news because of the fact that he appointed Wilton Gregory, who is the first African-American to be appointed a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, right? Which is obviously, from a racial diversity standpoint, is obviously pretty cool. I think that greatly overshadows the really important appointee, but we'll get to that in this video here today, right? Nonetheless, Pope names 13 new cardinals, including Wilton Gregory of Washington. This is from Crux Now. It was written yesterday, which is the 25th of 2020. On Sunday, Pope Francis announced the creation of 13 new cardinals, including American Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington, making him the first African American to get a red hat. Now, that word creation is probably pretty interesting. Why does it use the word creation? Well, because it's not like there was a vacancy that he was then filling, right? Rather, the Pope has actually quite literally packed the College of Cardinals to his liking and made it larger than it previously was. Just to give you an idea of this, right? I'm going to go ahead and look up really quick to see how many people were in the College of Cardinals when Pope Francis became the Pope. So just one second. How many cardinals? And let's go with 2010. Francis has created, this isn't giving me the number that I was looking for, but it is still gives you an idea. Has created 88 cardinals from 56 countries, 17 of which have never been represented in the College of Cardinals, as well as the first Scandinavian since the Reformation. Very important because the Scandinavian countries were the first countries to become officially Protestant. Let's see. Yeah, it's not, for whatever reason, it's not actually telling me exactly how many it was. I mean, it gives you the idea, of course, but I was looking more for the exact number. Nonetheless, that's okay. You see, obviously, the point, right? The man has created 88 cardinals. 73 of the cardinals of voting age out of 128 are his, right? So you get the idea. Speaking during the Sunday Angelus address, Pope Francis confirmed rumors that have been circulating for days, announcing a November 28th consistory, which falls on the vigil of the first Sunday of the Church's liturgical season of Advent. Gregory, the only cardinal to be named, is one of the few African-American bishops in the United States and succeeded Cardinal Donald Wuerl, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, who resigned after allegations in the wake of a 2018 Pennsylvania grand jury report that he allowed predator priests to receive pension money despite years of accusation of sexual abuse. Of course, we reported a lot on that actually on the Watchdog. In total, Francis named 9 cardinals under the age of 80, meaning they are eligible to vote in the next conclave, and 4 who are over 80, meaning the title is mostly honorary in recognition of their service to the church. Excuse me. He gave the red hat to several key allies in the Roman Curia, including Maltese Bishop Martin Gretsch. By the way, that is a typo. It is actually Mario Gretsch. But nonetheless, the newly appointed Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, and Bishop Marcello Semeraro, who was recently appointed prefect of the Vatican's Congregation for the Cause of Saints. Briefly, let's pause. I want to give a little bit of background about Mario Gretsch, this guy right here, who was just appointed to be a cardinal, right? Scheduled for November 28th of 2020, as you can see here. Because this man is the man who I am personally focused on out of these 13 and 9 who actually have the ability to vote. It is cool in a way that Wilton Gregory is being appointed because he is the first African American. Not bad. Kind of cool for a racial diversity standpoint. However, Mario Gretsch is much more interesting from a what is the agenda of Pope Francis now standpoint. And I think you'll see, that a lot of my reasons for suspecting him here, or for being suspicious of him here, are quite intriguing, to say the least. Now, first off, we see there's no letters after his name, right? No SJ, so he's not a Jesuit. No DD, so he's not a doctorate. So, in some ways that does mean you're not a Franciscan friar or anything like that. In some ways that does mean there's a little bit less to go off of as far as what exactly does he believe, but there's still plenty for us to see here. So, he was appointed on November 26th, 2005 by Pope Benedict XVI, the Bishop of Gozo, which is in Malta. Received his episcopal consecration on January 22nd of 2006 from his predecessor in Gozo, Bishop Nicole Joseph Cauchy. In 2011, he joined other Maltese bishops in advising Catholics to defeat a referendum that would allow the legislature to consider legalizing divorce. Notice this portion here. So in 2011, he is joining, along with other Maltese bishops, together with conservatives in his country, to make sure that divorce does not actually become legalized, right? So it seems like he's a conservative then, right? As president of the Episcopal Conference of Malta, he participated in the Synod of Bishops on the Family in 2014 and 15. Speaking to the Synod in October 2014, Gretsch said that, quote, the doctrine of the faith is capable of progressively acquiring a greater depth, and that addressing people in complex familial situations or homosexuals or parents of homosexuals, quote, it is necessary to learn to speak that language which is known to contemporary human beings, and also acknowledge it as a way of conveying the truth and the charity of the gospel. So, okay, not so conservative anymore, right? He believes that we can progressively get more revelation over time by studying the word. And of course, that comes through the church, not through your individual revelation, right? So when I say we can progressively get revelation over time, I mean humanity, right? And obviously that's a big thing in and of itself. He's also wishy-washy on things like homosexuality, right? So there's that. But then we move on even further. Because in December of 2018, he said that he enjoyed discussions with atheists that sharpened his own beliefs and preferred dialogue to the confrontation his critics preferred. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. It sounds like it's not problematic. It sounds like all he's saying is basically the same thing that I would say or any other debater would say, which is that having these dialogues has definitely made me sharper and allowed me to pinpoint where exactly I have, weaknesses and strengths in my theology and so on and so forth. But in reality, with the context here, what he actually ends up saying in this situation, and you know this because he says he prefers this dialogue to the confrontation his critics prefer, right? What he's actually saying is basically that we should be reaching across the aisle and not rebuking, right? As many of you have probably seen now with my own conversations, for example, with the Raging Atheist, right? You can be peaceful without, quote unquote, reaching across the aisle, right? Me and the Raging Atheist are not on the same side. That doesn't mean I can't treat him like he's a human being. You don't have to compromise your ideals, your beliefs, your convictions in order to be respectable, in order to be respectful, in order to be kind even. This is something that is very often used by liberals, both religiously speaking and politically speaking, to stop people from revealing harsh truths. Harsh truths, ladies and gentlemen, are loving. To withhold harsh truths because they potentially might hurt someone's feelings is not loving. You can provide harsh truths without being insulting, without being degrading, without telling people they're worthless, etc. But withholding harsh truths is not loving. It is the exact opposite of that. And in this particular situation, that is what Mario Gretsch is guilty of. It does indeed get worse, though. If someone comes to me asking me for help to discover Jesus Christ, this is a direct quote, he or she could be homosexual, and even in a homosexual relationship, it doesn't matter. Of course, it does matter. Now, if you're a homosexual and you hear this, I want you to know that Christ's offer of salvation is for you as well. I can't get too deep into this because this is my new show. It's not my apologetic show, but I would be remiss if I did not at least mention it. Christ's offer of salvation is to you as well. But if homosexuality wasn't a sin, what would you even need salvation for in the first place? You don't give somebody grace because they're living a perfectly righteous life. I digress, though. I will not impede that person. On the contrary, I would help. The last thing I would do is take up a position against that person. Before we would say, put your life in order first, then we'll begin the journey towards God. No, that's not true. That's not what we say. You do not put your life in order first, and then we begin the journey towards God. God is who indeed puts your life in order. But you can say that without compromising your ideals. Today, on the other hand, we would say, let us approach Jesus Christ, and Christ will help us put our lives in order. Notice that he said the same thing there that I says, but what he's going about it, or how he's going about it, is completely different, and it's all wrong, right? And this is the such an important thing when it comes to untruth, ladies and gentlemen. People can say the exact same things and mean completely and totally different things. For example, when Pope Francis said, for homosexuals, who am I to judge? He is saying that he, as the supreme pontiff, quote unquote, because that's what Catholics believe he is not actually going to definitively teach on homosexuality, not homosexuals, right? If I, on the flip side, were to say, who am I to judge? The context would be in something along the lines of, this is clearly a sin, but only you know whether or not God is actually working in your life, and whether or not this is, you're a Christian who has a very serious struggle and addiction, we might say, or, something different. You can say the exact same things, get completely different results because the person's own context, not only that they're portraying it in, but in the context of their own life. Black and white still exists, says Mario Gretsch, but the gray area in between has grown. That's not true. The gray area in between has been human-sized, and it always will be human-sized. There's no such thing as moral gray areas. Human beings, because we are a fallen species, are gray. It is the exact same size as humans. It will always be the exact same size of humans, that gray hole in the matrix, if you will. But the gray area in between has grown, he says. It is in the gray areas that we must search, he says. That's why I said that I am wary of those priests or Christians who feel they already know all the answers. No one can make that claim. We all have to continue searching, end quote. And of course, that's just a dig at people who disagree with him, and that doesn't actually have any substance behind it whatsoever. Moving further, on October 2nd, 2019, Pope Francis named him Pro-Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops in anticipation of succeeding Cardinal Lorenzo, excuse me if I mispronounce this, Baldisseri, when he retired as Secretary General. Gretsch worked alongside Baldisseri and participated as a member of the Synod of Bishops for the Pan-Amazon region. Now, those of you who have watched this program in the past, you probably have somewhat of an idea of what this actually is, right? Because as I have stated before on this program, this Amazon Synod is a huge problem. And as I've stated about a year ago, this Amazon, as we reported, I should say about a year ago, this Amazon Synod actually completely and totally upends any sort of not only biblical, but even ecclesial authority, right? Watch former Watchdogs on that topic there. He was one of 5 Synod officials who served ex officio on the 15-person commission that was responsible for drafting the final document of the Amazon Synod. The same Amazon Synod that called Pachamama, the Incan goddess, Our Lady of the Amazon. The same way they say, Our Lady Fatima or Our Lady Mary. The same Amazonian Synod where the writer of the Synod's final document actually said that all rites, R-I-T-E-S, were worship of the biblical God. The same Amazonian Synod where Pope Francis himself, as well as the person who headed the Synod, said, and I am not actually making this up, you can see it for yourself on the Watchdog, you can see it for yourself from LifeSite News, there's numerous other people who reported it, said that the church is going to be open to pagans. Yes, that Amazonian synod is where Mario Gretsch worked before he was a cardinal in Rome. But of course, let's focus on the guy who is an African American, because that's a big deal. And I'm not saying it's not a big deal per se. I am, however, saying that this is not something that you can just ignore, right? This Mario Gretsch. Mario Gretsch is a much bigger deal than see, I can't even remember the other guy's name. What is it? Come on, it's right up here. Gregory, Wilton Gregory. My friends, I think we're going to have to end this here. We've been going on for a while. Kind of made the point already. But what we've seen just here today is a judge who is very much a threat to certain very important libertarian principles get appointed to the United States Supreme Court. We saw the United Nations pushing forward global governance. We saw Trump pushing forward what definitely could be incredibly dangerous, quote unquote, peace in the Middle East. And we've seen the Pope turning the Catholic Church into more and more of a socialist cesspool. And ladies and gentlemen, I just think that it's something that we need to be wary of. So I'm going to go ahead and end this here. We're going to stop now. It's been nice. I appreciate all of you. As you can see, you can support me on Patreon with the link there below if you feel that it is something that is necessary, if you feel that this is news that needs to be published out there. I would appreciate any of that. But I just want you guys to be vigilant, right? I want you guys to be vigilant because conservatives and liberals both are lying to you. Globalists and localists both are lying to you. The religious and the non-religious are lying to you. There's so much misinformation in the world and so much things that we're just indeed not even talking about. This push towards global towards global governance, towards a United Nations of religions, towards completely upending traditionalist institutions like the Catholic Church, right? This is where we're at. This is where we've been at for quite some time. So be vigilant and just make sure that you are noting these things when you see them. I'll be back on with you guys on Wednesday with another episode of the Watchdog. Links to all of the articles will be in the description below, as well as links to not only my Patreon, but also any social media websites you would like to follow me on: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, whatever, right? So thank you guys for watching. I'm sorry to end abruptly, but I'm just still not particularly good at all the pizzazz of this. So I'm sorry. But nonetheless, I do have a question for you. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise?